We're starting a little bit late, sorry, but it's good to have this time together. Everything going good back in Larry at your church? Everything going good? Good? All right. Glad to have Larry and Terry with us tonight, and just good to have fellowship with fellow believers in Christ, and so happy they're here. Happy everyone's here to be with us, and that there is people. Once again, glad to be back in church. Been talking to a lot of the ministers up there at the camp about what they've been doing and what's going on with their church. Everybody's pretty happy up there. Everybody's praising the Lord that they can be back in church. So anyways, I wanted to just as a little bit of a reminder where we were in Exodus. Been looking through the book of Exodus. Tonight, since we're starting late, we won't get too far through it. That's okay. It'll pick up right after this. It's going to get going here soon. But I wanted to just, as we survey through Exodus, to take a look, stop for a minute here and there to see what God is trying to show us through the book of Exodus. And as I said, book of Exodus is such an amazing book, such an amazing glimpse of redemption, of God's redemption. And looking to the future, redemption of His people and of each of us, it is on display through the book of Exodus. And in this book here, we see God giving Israel a heritage. And like I said, I think I talked about it last week, Pharaoh could have just said, okay, go ahead, you're good, take your people and go worship your God. And he could have let them go, but that's not what happened. That's not what we see. And but because of what happened there, because of what God did there, God could have also just took His people and took off. He could have just done whatever He wanted to do, but He decided to show the world that He is the one true God, and that through Him and Him alone is redemption, comes mercy and grace, and so without, if there's no resurrection, we can't have resurrection, I guess, without the cross, can we? We've got to go through some things and see some things, and we can celebrate our history, our own lives. We went through some things before we were saved, and now we can look back and give God glory for Him miraculously saving us out of this world and the things He's done for us. But I talked about a little bit last time on how Moses, when he comes to that burning bush and he gets introduced to God as the great I am, we talked about that name, Yahweh or Jehovah, and how that's the way it's just initials, it's just letters. And but when you look at that, it's so neat how that I respect the Jewish people. I love what they do. They don't even say that word. They will not say that name. We don't really know how to properly pronounce it. We have put it together and say it's Yahweh, because those initials, if they had vowels in there, it looks like it would say that. It looks like it would say Yahweh, but it's really just consonants, and it doesn't say anything. So we think the way it's said is Yahweh, but they would not even say the word out loud because they thought that was disrespectful to God. They said, "We are so lowly, I am so unworthy, I'm not even worthy to say His name." And they don't write His name, and we spoke on that. A lot of the Jewish writings, if they come to the word God, it just say G-D. They won't say it. They won't even write it because of their reverence for God. Just as Moses took his shoes off as he approached the burning bush, as God instructed him to do, they still have reverence and awe and honor toward God. And I think we can all glean a little something from that too, especially as we enter into prayer with God. And I talked about how we sometimes charge into prayers disrespectfully, when we need to stop and enter a prayer out of reverence for God, recognize who He is, slow down, take a breath, and think about who we're speaking to, and what a glorious thing it is to have the ability to speak to God. How amazing that is. We talk about miracles in here. We've been talking a lot about miracles because they've been on display in our church lately, and praise God for miracles. But it is a miracle of God that we can talk to God. And the Bible tells us over and over again that He will lend us His ear. He hears our prayers. And that's a miracle. That is a miracle in itself. Just think, when we read about the burning bush, we think how amazing that was. If you get that vision in your head of Him seeing that bush that was burned and was not consumed, what an amazing miracle that was. We're allowed to see the same thing every night that we bow on our knees, every day that we bow our knees and open our heart to God and pray to Him, and He hears our prayer. We're seeing this. We're a part of the same miracle that Moses was a part of. Shouldn't we enter that with that same kind of gracious awe that Moses had when he saw that? And so that's a wonderful thing. And we went on, and Moses, he started making those excuses. We see as he starts to say, "God, who am I? Who am I that I should speak to Pharaoh?" We talked about in the need his raising, and we looked at Hebrews and some of the places we talked about. We know how old he was in his ages. Basically, Moses, the events of his life happened in 40s. So he was 40 years old when he fled Egypt, and he was living in the wilderness for 40 years, and then he was with the people of Israel for 40 years and before he died. And so we see those events of his life, though. He's in Egypt being raised up. He was rescued and raised as a prince in Egypt, had access to the best mathematics, the best astrology, the best teachings that the world at that time had to offer, and was trained up in the kingdom. You imagine when he was sent back to go talk to Pharaoh, he knew where to go. He knew how to approach them, how to speak to them, and what manner to speak, what mannerisms to use before the king. He knew all this stuff because he'd lived in the palace. What better man? He says, who am I? What better man to send back? And then he also trained him for 40 years in the wilderness, sheep herding, and in that wilderness, that's where he was going to be with those guys for 40 years after this. He had to know how to find water, for all those animals, how to survive and find food in a barren wasteland. And he lived there for 40 years and trained doing that very task. So what better man? God was just training him up and training him up. And some people, though, would say, I don't have any skills, I can be of no use to God. Well, I guarantee you think you don't have use or don't have a purpose, you do. And God has got use for you in his kingdom in some way or another. You just need to ask him what it is if you don't know what it is. But so that's a little bit of a recap of where we're at. And we're finally to the point where Moses had said, I can't speak. And he said, you remember this, I'll send Aaron. And God spoke to Aaron. And God tells Aaron, he says, go out and meet your brother, your little brother. He was 3 years older than him. Go meet him. And so Aaron goes and meets Moses. Those two get together. And, Aaron knows that what he's about is God's business because God spoke to him himself and said, go meet Moses. And so Moses and Aaron come before the elders. We see them come before the elders of Israel to tell them what's going on. They said, hey, God has heard your groanings. He's heard your murmurings, your moanings, and God is here to rescue. And this is God's here to do this thing. And we know if they had access to the scrolls, they would have been able to look back and seen that this had already been predicted. Abraham had been told this very thing. Your people will end up in a place where they'll be in bondage for 430 years. And one day they'll be released. And so this is the day. We've been here 400 years. It's time to go. And they get on board with it at first. And then we're going to see that things don't go exactly as they had planned. And Pharaoh says they all took the day off work because they thought God was going to release them that day. And the Pharaoh says, what are you doing here and why aren't you working? And he makes them go out, the story, and go gather and make the bricks that they were making for the cities. They built Ramses and a couple other cities, the minor cities in Egypt. They did not build the pyramids. But they said, go back to work and you can find your own straw going forward, but I still want the same amount of bricks. And really put his taskmasters hard on them. And we see the Israelites start to complain, and they won't stop doing that for 40 more years. But as we look through, as we get going today and thinking about this, Moses said, how will I convince them? And you remember that's where God said, take the rod. What's that in your hand? And he said, well, it's a rod, and it's a shepherd's staff, really. And he said, take it and throw it down the ground. Remember, it turned into a snake. And he showed him a couple of things. He said, do those things, and the elders will believe you. And that's what the things he's going to do before Pharaoh. And, where we start on about chapter 7. And as I survey, I'll just kind of slide through some verses here. We'll look at these. But when we see here, and I know you guys, a lot of you know this story. Hopefully we can pick up on a couple of things that maybe you do not know or not thought about in a long time or haven't seen. And that's really all the idea of this study is together. Let's freshen our minds with the story that we've been told since we were that tall, and maybe see some things that God's got for us here. That's why it's the living word. Every time you pick it up, something new jumps out at you, doesn't it? You can read one verse today and say, okay, God, I understand. Read it tomorrow and be like, oh, God, you got something else for me out of that. Okay. So we serve a mighty, amazing God. So I'll start chapter 7 here. Like I said, about verse 10 is where we're going to see Moses and Aaron go into Pharaoh. They approach Pharaoh. And here's the thing. I need you guys to kind of get Charlton Heston out of your mind for a little bit. We've all watched the movie, and that is imprinted in our heads. Great movie. But something not, kind of get that out of your head just a little bit as we go through it. Maybe see it in your own manners, but see it as God's Word portrays here. but it's spot on a lot of things, but some things are a little bit different. But okay, so as Moses and Aaron, they go in to see Pharaoh, and the Lord commanded and told him what to do. He does it. Aaron cast down his rod before Pharaoh and before his servants, and it became a serpent. And immediately, this is the kind of the twist where Pharaoh calls his wise men and his magicians and his sorcerers, and we don't know how long it took them. We don't know if they just walked in right away and done this thing like it was just something they were able to do. Most people say it was probably an illusion, it was a sleight of hand, whatever they did, but they were able to come in and duplicate that miracle. And they threw down their rods and it became snakes. And but what we see there is that what was so neat about it is, and that's in verse 12, where their rods became a snake. Or no, verse 12 is where they cast down and became a snake. But Aaron's rod swallowed up their rods. And that is unique in the fact that Egyptians believed, kind of like American Indians, some groups, tribes of American Indians believed that if you killed the deer, you could eat its heart. And if you eat its heart, you would gain its power. There's lots of peoples that have that kind of philosophy. The Egyptians were one of those. So they believed that if you consumed something, you took its power. You took its essence of its soul into your body. So that was one unique thing about this. Not only did it swallow up those other ones, it was basically, in the Egyptians' mind, they just saw that snake swallow up their snake's power. Everything that they were about, it swallowed their power, and not just the snake. So there's a lot going on there just other than that. But either way you look at it, even if you don't know that fact, that's kind of neat. That already on display is God's power and God's might. And we see that Pharaoh, though, refuses this. And God had told Moses, Pharaoh was going to harden his heart. And also, God's told Pharaoh, I'll see to it that he does later on. And I went out there 2 days ago at church camp and sat on the bench there when the kids were in class. And I feel like God's laid something on my heart. I'll probably be preaching real soon on that very idea. But anyways, but Pharaoh hardens his heart to this. And what we'll see is he doesn't believe. He refused to let him go. Moses said, let my people go. In verse 15, we see there where Moses goes down to meet Pharaoh in the morning on the water's edge. And in 16 says, let my people go that they may serve me in the wilderness. God, and really Moses here at first, he's just asking, hey, let us go for 3 days. Let us take off for 3 days and go worship God in the wilderness. He doesn't say let us go for good. That's all. It seems like a pretty easy request there. But Pharaoh, he doesn't want to give an inch, does he? And he could have done this thing, but we see there the level of the hardness of Pharaoh's heart. Because when he refuses to even let him go for 3 days, Moses has got to know then, well, there's no way he's going to let these people go for good. We see how stern he's going to be and how stern he is there. But he will not let him go. And so we see Moses here strikes the water and with his staff, and when he does, the water's turned to blood. And they turn to blood, and not only did the water turn to blood, it caused the fish to die. And I don't know, probably a few of them gators or those crocodiles died that had been eating the baby Egyptians. You can imagine they've been throwing those babies in the water, drowning, and now all these fish and probably the crocodiles, those things die. And it wasn't just the water of the Nile, it was the water everywhere that is consumed up by this going on. We see the magicians in verse 22 says that the Egyptians did so with their enchantments. And Pharaoh's heart was hardened again. So we see that his heart was hardened with this. But people always seem to find a way to justify or dismiss God's judgments. Let's think about 9/11. I don't know. I'm not saying that was a judgment of God. But wow, that was something. People came back to church, and you've heard me say this. I've made this quote many times. A lot of people said people came back to church for 2 months. Just came back. I saw about 2 weeks where I was. 2 weeks, and people were like, they were over it. And maybe you saw something different. And I know there was some people that changed their life for good. But what about this coronavirus? The scare that we've had through that? There were some people there for a while very frightened. Like I said, the first service I preached on that little phone right there online, there was 1,300 people watched. 1,300 people watched. Now we're back down to, last week we had 300, I think, which is still up. That's up from what we were. But people, they get over it, don't they? They find a reason to justify. So we have major earthquakes, things that hit, devastating things. And people will go, we're a nation that has turned from God. We're killing babies. We're doing all this stuff with homosexuality, and we're redefining marriage. We're just turn God out. And things will happen, and a lot of people say, oh my goodness, is this a judgment of God? Well, then pretty soon, don't they start to say, well, according to seismologists, earthquakes happen, and this one was destined to happen anyways. We just see people find a way to harden their hearts, justify what's going on in their life, and they seem to dismiss God's judgments. And the same thing can be said of this, and I will throw this out there too. We'll dismiss God's miracles. Christians will dismiss God's miracles, and we'll see miracles. We have miracles. We've seen them happen. But as time goes by, we still know that. We'll still tout about, we'll still brag on that miracle that happened. But sometimes something else will happen in our lives, and we'll doubt God. We'll doubt Him. We'll doubt the God of the universe. When we have witnessed, we have seen Him, we've seen a display of miracles happen in the church. But won't we do that? We do that thing. People find a way to harden their hearts and to justify God's judgments or miracles, and that's a sad thing, but it does happen. And so we see here that's what Pharaoh does. And Pharaoh hardens his heart to this. But all this stuff happens with, and I used to use verse 24. This is way off topic, but I got a grant one time to put in water wells, a big water well system in a town, and we actually we came back away from the shore and put in pipes down deep. We knocked the shore out, and then we put in different levels of rock from sand all the way out to a great big riprap on the river. And it's called riverbank filtration. And so the muddy old river would come down and filter through all that rock, sand, and gravel, and enter the pipe and come in almost just beautiful out of this muddy river. And I used to tell people about this right here. I used to say, we're on the cutting edge of ancient technology. And then I would tell them, and I used to say that, I said that when I was trying to sell it to my board members, I said that in public meetings, but I would say the ancient Egyptians, when the river was turned to blood, that's what they had to do. They had to dig down in the sand near the river's edge to try to find water that was a little bit purified so they could actually drink. And what we see them doing here. And 7 days were fulfilled after the Lord had smitten the river. So 7 days they lived with that river. And here's the thing. You're going to hear everybody say, well, and I've seen it too. I know you've seen the red algae. There's the red tides in the ocean. There was one this last year, I think, off the coast of California, Northern California, and it's miles in diameter, and it happens in China, and algae, it's red algae, and people say, well, it's probably that red algae. Who cares? It was red. The fish all died. Well, that would happen with algae. The fish would die. But when they died, it was all blood too. Who's to say it wasn't no blood? The power's in the blood. I don't know. Who's to say that God did not use it? A lot of times we get in trouble when we try to define God's miracles by science. And I love to do that myself. I love to talk about the science behind when I try to dismantle evolution, the thought of macroevolution. But at the same time, we must understand that we serve a supernatural God who does supernatural miracles. And why not? He can do anything He wants with the clay He made in our hands. If He chooses to heal my body today of something, Christine's pretty hard to understand what happened. A mass, a tumor that was there, everybody's seeing it. 2 hospitals confirm it. A team of doctors are trying to figure out how they can go in and fix this thing that they're looking at, and then they open it up and it's gone. It's not there, period. But and you can try to sit back all day long and go, well, maybe the enzymes, maybe God. Maybe God just went, boop, gone. That may be what happened. And we do sometimes try to justify even the good things of God, don't we? We try to justify them. Well, why would we do that? Don't justify the good things of God. Why? Just say, God, thank you. God, thank you for your glory, for your miracle working power. And sometimes we go through it. Little Weston had to go through it. Christine went through this pain of this horrific pain of this too. All that Weston went through is, I'm not downplaying that in the least. My goodness, what Gus has went through, what Ralph's wife Lucille has went through, and so many in this church we know have went through it. But in the end, we've seen some miracles at the end of that happen. And just like Christine's most recent one, she went through this horrific pain. But at the end, listen. There's no resurrection without the cross. Just like these people, God gave the Israelites a heritage. that they had anchored to. This is the greatest event that ever happened in their life because of the events that unfold right here in these chapters of redemption, of God's glory on display. And so anyways, why didn't they take the blood away? If they're so good, so they were able to make some water look like it turned to blood, why couldn't they make the river turn back to water? They couldn't. And that's the point. But Pharaoh saw that as an opportunity to justify this and say no to it. Now, and some few things about the Nile River. I don't know if you know anything, and I think I mentioned this in one of the first times we talked about this. If the Nile River wasn't there, Egypt is a wasteland. It's a desert wasteland. But because of the Nile, it supplies that makes them one of the most fertile places. It allowed this to be one of the first great civilizations that we know of because of that Nile River coming in and flooding each year and bringing in the nutrients that it brought to make that soil so fertile. It flows north to south, or no, south to north, excuse me. It flows south to north, which is very odd. Most rivers don't flow like that. But the Nile River, because they relied so much on this river, that they gave this river over to their deities. They nearly worshipped the Nile River, the Egyptians did. And one of their main gods there was called Hapi, and it's H-A-P-I, and I think I mentioned that recently. I think I did, but anyways, what it did, see, they looked at this river. Their whole means of agriculture, their whole means of life was dependent upon the Nile River. And so this was, to them, it was the river of life. And God turned it to the river of death for 7 days when he said, let my people go, or this is going to happen. And he turned the river of life to the river of death. But here's the other thing. What we're going to see through each of these plagues, and many of you know this already, is the Egyptians had many gods. And one of these was Hapni. And there's Apis is the bull god. They have so many that are tied into, and I talked about Hapi, that's what I was talking about, because Hapi was the goddess of fertility. We think that possibly when this princess came down to the water a lot of people thought she came down to bathe. Well, most people believe that was a ritual, that she came down that morning because we know that she never had kids and could not have kids, so she was going down to have a conversation with the goddess Hapni and go through the ritual bathing process because she wanted to have a child. And so when here comes floating along a basket with a baby inside, she received that baby as a gift from her god Hapni. She thought this is why. So that's why she took in this Hebrew child. Possibly what most people say and believe. But you think about that Isis is a goddess here too. She's the goddess of the Nile. There's like 4 gods that have something to do with the Nile. Even the god Ra, which is their main god, they all are tied in with this. And the first plague that we see on Egypt is God doing this. Now here's the thing. Their magicians couldn't turn it back to water, but neither could their gods. Until Moses' God said, I'm going to turn it back to water, they stayed blood. So right now off that, we're going to set the stage here. This is really a battle against God versus Satan. God versus this satanic cult of these many gods. And God is going to prove to the Egyptians and the Hebrews alike that there is only one true God. And all your gods, lower G, are not real. And so we see this being the first one. This first one was huge. So anyways, I think there's something like Osiris was one of their gods, and they believe the Nile was part of his bloodstream. And so that tells something about the blood too there. But anyway, so we're going down to chapter 8, and the Lord spake to Moses after Pharaoh had hardened his heart again, go unto Pharaoh and say to him, thus says the Lord, let my people go, that they may serve me. And if thou refuse to let them go, behold, I will smite all thy borders with frogs. And you go ahead and keep the Charlton Heston idea of that, because that one fits it very well. And some of these do. They did a good job with that movie, of course. But here we see down in verse 7, the magicians did so with their enchantment. So these frogs come out of the river. They go everywhere. They're in everything. They're in the house. My niece is in Saipan, and she talks about in Saipan they have 2 things. They have rats everywhere, and they have lizards, little lizards. And she says she's gotten so accustomed to them, it's just no big deal to her. But she said, you'll open up your utensil drawer and a lizard will run out. And so they're just everywhere. They're everywhere. And she said, you just get used to them. And Jenny has said that would never happen with her. But either the lizards or the rats. But anyway, she said they don't have anything else. There's nothing else there animal-wise that's anything bad. But these frogs would be in their house. They would have been everywhere in everything. What a nasty thing this would have been. But this is really about the goddess of fertility. Another goddess of fertility they had was Hequet, which is Hequet, Hequet. So the goddess Hequet is, and they have other names. So if you hear me say a name tonight and you go home and look it up in your concordance and say, no, he said Hequet, it's not Hequet, it's this, you're probably right, because they had several of these same gods. They had 2 or 3 names for the same god. But Hequet, she was believed to be the spirit that gives life, and she has the head of a frog. And here's the thing, because of the goddess Hequet, the goddess of fertility, of life-giving fertility, and like I said, that's the same. That is true. There was still the goddess of the Nile that has something to do with fertility as well, as charge of that. But this one here, she is this Hequet goddess. She, because she's the goddess of this and has the head of a frog, the Egyptians cannot kill frogs. So it's against their religion to kill frogs. Because you wonder, why don't they just shut the door and start stepping or something? But they can't kill frogs. And so they're invaded by these frogs, and to them they can do nothing about it. You think of the Hindus with the cattle, and things. They're just all over the place. In India, they can't do anything about it because that could be, your uncle. So same thing here with the frogs. They can't do anything with them. And so, but then it says here in verse 7, and the magicians did so with their enchantments and brought up frogs upon the land of Egypt. But here's the thing I'm going to ask. Why did they make the frogs go back to the river then? If you can make them, so it seems like really you're doing this, but you're not. How did that help the problem? We got a gazillion frogs everywhere, and my magicians just made more frogs. Great, And Pharaoh hardens his heart again. It's like, really? Because I would like to see my magicians get rid of a few frogs, or chase them back, Pied Piper thing to the river there instead of bringing us more. But he says here, Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron and said, entreat the Lord that he may take away the frogs from me, because we can't kill them. And if you do that, I'm gonna let your people go. We know it's a lie. We know it's not going to happen. But that's what he asked for. And so it says, let's see, down in 14. I'm still in chapter 8. And they gathered them together upon heaps, and then the land stank. The land's been stinking for a while now, between the river and now the frogs. But the Lord gets rid of the frogs from them, and now they're all dead. That almost be a slap in the face to someone that worships these frogs, so we can't kill them. And when he asked Moses, tell your God to get rid of them, he kills them. And now we got to scoop them up, pile them in heaps. And so that would have been, I'm sure, very, very nasty. But in verse 16, we're going to see the third plague. Saying to Aaron, stretch out thy rod and smite the dust of the land, that it may become lice throughout all the land of Egypt. And the dust, can you imagine how much dust there is? He says, smote the dust there, and it became lice in man, in verse 17, and in beast, and all the dust of the land became lice throughout all the land of Egypt. And the magicians, guess what? Did so with their enchantments, tried to bring forth lice, but this time they could not. But once again, what good are you doing to bring us more lice? Get rid of the lice. I'm sure Pharaoh surely is saying this at this point, but this time they couldn't do it. So now we see the magicians, sorcerers, wise men, suddenly they can't copy what God's doing anymore. And they called it the finger of God in that next verse. But what we most say is this is not lice like we think of today. This is more like, if you think along of those bull gnats that we have. Have you seen the bull gnats that after a flood or whatever, they come up and those gnats, they actually can bite you, and then they do. It gets really bad. It gets infected and everything else. So that's more of what we think this was, is not lice as we think about it, but it would have been more like gnats. And so pretty bad things. And most of these gnats that I'm talking about, they were pretty painful sting. I don't know if you know the ones I'm talking about for sure, but they're not a fun thing. And Pharaoh, Pharaoh too, remember, Pharaoh's God, right? So he's just right below Ra. Ra, the sun god, that's their big dog. And then right below him is Pharaoh himself. He's supposed to be a son of Ra. He's supposed to be birthed by Ra himself. And so Pharaoh is the guy, the king of Egypt. He's supposed to keep balance in all of Egypt. And what do you see here in these verses is this plague right here. We can see in verse 19 here. It's causing chaos. This is causing. Can you imagine gnats just almost being this overwhelming cloud of gnats? You know how they get in your eyes and these here sting and everything else.
And it just caused chaos because he also came upon the beast. So it's probably infecting the eyes of their cattle and of everything. And what an awful thing it would be. The finger of God, they called it. And of course, Pharaoh, once again, will not let it go. So we see in chapter 21, the fourth one there. If thou wilt not let my people go, behold, I will send swarms of flies upon thee, and upon thy servants and upon thy people, and into the houses, and the houses of the Egyptians shall be full of swarms of flies, also the ground whereon they are. And these may have been like what they call a dog fly. Beelzebub was considered the god of flies, and so Lord of flies. And there's another god with a name I can't recall it that they had there. But here we have these flies going everywhere. And but what I want to show you is it says in verse 22, these flies. Can you imagine biting flies? Whatever if you think about flies, everybody hates flies. So it's like the gnats, only a little bit bigger. Probably the bite's a little bit harder, and absolutely everywhere and everything. And then you know what flies, how they reproduce. You thought about what fly are in larval form? Pretty nasty. And so that's going on. More chaos in the land. Pharaoh, why are you not? You're Ra's son. Why are you doing this? Why is everything so upset in the land? Why can't you take care of this? But verse 22 is what I want to show you here. It says, and I will sever in that day the land of Goshen in which my people dwell, that no swarms of flies shall be there, to the end that thou may knowest that I am the Lord in the midst of the earth. And I will put a division between my people and thy people. Tomorrow shall this sign be. And so this is the first time that suddenly Israel doesn't have to go through the plagues. But see, for the first three, Israel went through the plagues. That'll preach all day long right there. But and what I was talking about earlier, with Weston, with Christine, with some of these we've seen that have had the miracle, they've had the deliverance in the end. They had to go through some stuff first. Well, we see the Israelites, they went through the first three plagues. So you can imagine, they had gnats. They had the frogs. They in the land of Goshen where they lived, they've had these things. But right here we're going to see it in. Boom. Now, from here on out, the rest of the plagues that hit, the Israelites over their land of Goshen are going to be sitting back watching, and they're not going to be affected by any of these plagues going forward. And if you thought all these miracles were something, now check this out, Pharaoh. See how God protects his own. Our one true God, the one true God of the universe, protects his own. And we'll see it happen here. If you read down through it, Pharaoh called for Moses in verse 25 and for Aaron and said, go ye, sacrifice to your God in the land. And he says, I'm done with this. It's too much. He sees the division. He sees God's protection over his people. And he says, all right, you guys just go. But we're going to see here the pattern that going forward, we're going to find out Pharaoh is a great big fat liar. Because down in the last verse in 32, and Pharaoh hardened his heart at this time also, neither would he let the people go. And so once again, he's going to do that. So anyways, that's got us through those first four plagues. And I know it's awful early. We started so late. I'm going to have to end it right there tonight, I guess. But it's interesting that we see this is not about Pharaoh and Moses and these people as much as it is who God is. It's God demonstrating redemption, just demonstrating mercy. And we're going to see that going forward. There's a plague over here. God says, I'm going to do this thing with the hailstones. Remember, he says, I'm going to rain hailstones on the earth. But he tells them, if he tells the Egyptians too, he says, listen, put your livestock up. And it tells us later or the next verse that they did. Some of the Egyptians were like, you know what? They're starting to believe in that God. They're like, I'm seeing this God. So a bunch of them put up their beasts, put up their cattle and hide them. And when the hailstones come down, theirs are protected. God rains down his mercy on the just and the unjust, in that instance. So God is a God of mercy, demonstrating his power and his miracles, his wonder-working power here, and most of all, his redemption for those that believe. And so this is an awesome book. I love it, and I love it. We're going to see more and more as we go through the book of God's redemption and his mercy. But so anyways, sorry we only made it that far tonight, but we will get to the rest of it next time and possibly go forward. We'll talk about the great Passover, and that's the greatest marked holiday tradition, greatest event in all of Israel's history, still celebrated today. And so we'll look at that. We'll make it through that next time, hopefully a little bit beyond that.